It's a great honor to introduce Charlayne Hunter-Gault for the third and final Macmillan Stewart Lecture for 2003. And as those of you who have attended the previous lectures know, she has given us a brilliant display of her journalistic talents. To recap her career, she began as a reporter for The New Yorker, followed by a stint as a news anchor for WRC-TV in Washington, D.C. She then worked at the New York Times for 10 years, including serving as the Times Harlem bureau chief. For 20 years, she was the national correspondent for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. In 1997, she became the chief correspondent in Africa for NPR. And lastly, in 1999, she joined CNN, where she currently serves as the Johannesburg bureau chief and correspondent. In her long and distinguished career in print, radio, and television news, she has won numerous awards, including 2 Emmys and 2 Peabody Awards. In 2000, the Africa America Institute honored her with the Chairman's Award for Excellence in Media and for balanced reporting on Africa. In addition, she holds more than 24 honorary degrees. Now, of course, as you all know, Charlayne Hunter-Gault was the first black woman admitted and to graduate from the University of Georgia. And as Bob Giles noted in his introduction yesterday, when Charlayne and Hamilton Holmes were admitted to the University of Georgia, it ignited a firestorm of white racist resentment. In the African American community, they were widely hailed as heroes of the civil rights movement for their courage. It is perhaps difficult for students today to understand the magnitude of this event in African American history. And for my generation, it is an event that is seared upon my memory, representing both the best hopes of black people in that moment and the darkest side of white racism. As a native of Atlanta, Georgia, whose family also came from Covington, Georgia, the small town 30 miles outside of Atlanta where Charlayne's family also lived, she was seen as the best gift that the small, proud black community of that town had to give to the world. From the time she entered the University of Georgia to her first appearance in print, her life had become the stuff of bedtime stories for children in Covington and Atlanta.
Oh, wow.
Yet, as we lionized her, few spoke publicly about the difficulties of such high visibility for a young person who just wanted to lead a normal life. As she has poignantly recounted in her memoir, In My Place, she and her dates struggled with the constant attention, the quote, hovering, excuse me, I know you're dancing, but I just wanted to say, kind of attention, as she says, was perhaps more than anyone could reasonably expect a healthy 20 or 21-year-old male to deal with. And while many people would not have recovered easily from such early fame, as she notes, pioneering has always been an unsettling experience. Charlayne Hunter-Gault used those heady, difficult early years to develop a, quote, sharp radar for disharmony and intolerance. And in my view, she also developed a deep capacity to see hope where others see only chaos and despair. And these strengths, first forged in the last days of American apartheid, allow her to bring unique and powerful insights into the complexities of the current transformations underway in Africa. Today, her remarks are entitled, Reporting New News Out of Africa, Challenges from Within and Without. Please welcome again Charlayne Hunter-Gault.
Thank you so much. Introductions like that will keep me here. And receptions, too. Thank you all who've stuck it out for 3 days. My African Greek chorus and others. Thank you for joining us today, which, alas, is my last time before you. And while I was dreading it, because I told Skip nobody wants to listen to anybody talk for an hour, I'm starting to get used to it. I'm starting to like it. Well, as my dear friend said, and I found this passage in my book, I think we may even be related, but if we're not, our families certainly work close together, which demonstrates what a real small world has always been, but we are more and more aware of it every day. So as she said, my topic today, since I've been talking about the new news being committed on the continent, my topic today is reporting new news, both from the inside and out. My father was an Army chaplain, and later he had his own church in Florida before he passed away a few years ago. And as I was growing up, I often sat in his congregation hanging on to his every word, because both he and my grandfather were brilliant public speakers. So I would sit there, usually in an Army chapel. The last one I remember was Alaska, before it was a state. And that's the subject of another lecture. Can I come back next year and talk about that? But I would sit there hanging on to his every word, especially one phrase that he always used. He would say, now, if you'll pardon the personal reference, and I knew then that a really good story was coming. He would go on to embellish his biblical text with a personal experience that would just bring the whole thing home. Well, I'm not going to take a page out of his book and preach today, but I am going to take a page out of his book to ask if you will indulge my discussion of Africa by starting with a personal reference. It comes from Harlem. We'll travel to Africa eventually, before the hour is up. I want to start in Harlem because it was there that I had a singular experience many years before I ever dreamed of living and working in Africa. And it was the best preparation I ever could have received. I was working for the New York Times, and I went to cover a press conference being held by the Black Panthers. In those days, they were fighting perceptions that they were a threat to national security, insisting instead that they were simply trying to uplift the community and take care of their own. A force created in the space opened by the American Civil Rights Revolution, which evolved into Black Power and Black is Beautiful, and for many of us, the first serious emotional contact with Africa. Many chose to go to Africa, though theirs was often a rude awakening. As the late, and I'm sure lamented, especially on this campus, Philippe Wamba recalled in his brilliant work, Kinship, he recalls the story of one African American who, quote, greeted Africans at the Dakar harbor, where he disembarked with an impassioned speech extolling the virtues of Pan-Africanism and expressing his joy to finally be home, but was met with an underwhelming response. Give us $1, Wamba reports one member of the African group, calling out as the African American finished his oration, "You from America, you got plenty dollar." "You big man, America's a rich country, this be a poor country, we need dollar, you give dollar." It's kind of like when they get to South Africa, and to my recollection, there was never any slave route from South Africa, but the brothers and sisters get off in Cape Town and look at all these beautiful buildings. I'm so glad to be home, and the Africans look at them like they have lost their minds. But I'm trying to encourage them to be tolerant. But those who stayed at home in America were spared this reality check, leaving us to make the contact through, among other things, African names for many of our children. My own son's name, Chuma, comes from the Igbo of Nigeria, and it means God's gift, which he has taken seriously to heart. Beyond names, donning dashikis and afros provided our other contact. But America's homegrown Black revolutionaries, like the Black Panthers, had evolved from its espousal of violent revolution to running in Harlem, at least, a free breakfast program for children. When I arrived to cover the press conference, a stern, intense young man wearing the Black Panther trademark of black beret, black matching black everything else, asked what media organization I was from. When I told him the New York Times, he promptly told me I was not welcome. "Why not?" I asked. "Because you work for the man, and the man ain't going to ever let you tell the truth about us." "But have you ever read anything I've written?" I asked him. "Didn't have to. I know it wouldn't be the truth," he said. I could see this conversation was going nowhere. So I moved in a different direction. I told him that since he had never seen anything I had written, maybe, just maybe, he was wrong about me and the man. And maybe, just maybe, if he let me in this one time and then read the paper the next day, he could judge for himself from a better informed position. If I failed to present a true picture of what had transpired, then bar me next time, but at least give me a chance. He stood there glaring at me for a few seconds, and if looks could kill, I wouldn't be here today. But finally he said, "Aight, but you got to come in right." Well, I was no Black Panther, but I had spent a little time on the street and had also been on the receiving end of coverage as a minor player in the Civil Rights Revolution. I had been around enough at that point to know exactly what he meant. Check your preconceptions at the door and be open to what you see. Thus, when I set out for South Africa in the fall of 1997, that was one of the pieces of baggage I carried, along with my trunks and other suitcases full of clothes, and it has served me well. My only regret is that now living in Africa, I know where to find the cheetahs and the leopards and the lions, but I don't know where to find that panther. I have a lot to thank him for the lessons I learned covering the Harlems of America and the people who live there have served me well in Africa. Not because the majority of the continent's inhabitants are like those in Harlem, people of color, but because like them, especially in those days, they got attention, but only of a particular kind. Either through their portrayals as pitiful examples of existential misery, or as criminals preying on society, or as the odd sports or musical figure making it against the odds. Having come out of a Black experience that was none of the above, my take on Black people was ipso facto different. I refused to be a cliche for journalists covering the University of Georgia's desegregation because I wasn't one. If they were looking for a pristine, pure symbol of the cause, I often told them to look elsewhere. I was committed, but I was also determined to be myself, whoever I was or was evolving to in the normal trajectory of a 19-year-old girl. When I was hired at the New Yorker just out of college with the unspoken understanding that the limits I faced were only those imposed by my imagination, I looked around and saw that many of the successful writers at the magazine were those who were providing unique perspectives of their own experiences. Ved Mehta, for example, was writing about being Indian and blind in a way no one else could have because they haven't and couldn't have walked even a mile, not even an inch, in his shoes. Moreover, when I looked around at the staff writers, none of them looked like me. It didn't take me long to figure out how I could get out of making coffee for the editors to concocting a different brew. Stories like no one was telling about the people and the things I knew best, my very own. It didn't take long. Reminiscences were big at the New Yorker in those days, so my first modest effort was, yes, a reminiscence. It was called 115th Between Lenox and Fifth, and it was a kind of extended tone poem, recalling the culture shock, albeit pleasant, of a 5-year-old small-town Georgia girl who enjoyed swinging through and climbing up trees in and around my backyard and arriving on asphalt playgrounds in New York's Harlem and being introduced to the kind of make-do games that they played and perfected, making dolls out of Coca-Cola bottles and string, jumping hopscotch in the streets with leftover bottle tops, and the railroad flats and the tall buildings so close together that I could sit in my uncle's window and talk to my friends next door, who spoke in a way I had never heard before, English to be sure, but with a Puerto Rican lilt. My first exposure to culture, different, but thankfully due to my entry point, not outside my comfort zone. I was once told that with the New Yorker's talk of the town space so limited, it was often the case that A papers didn't even make it. Only the A+ ones got in. Thanks to the rich culture abounding in Harlem, like the Black bookstore with the largest collection of books by and about Black people, at home and in the diaspora, where the diminutive wizened owner, one Louis Michaud, was giving to dishing out a wisdom reflected of the place and the time, spoken in couplets like, "The white man's dream of being supreme has turned to sour cream." His store One block up from the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, a corner that served as a focal point for black grievances and aspirations, articulated over the decades by men such as Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, and thanks to Skip, we can see them on our computers. Same corner. I carried that experience with me into the late 60s when cities of America erupted in flames, to almost everyone's surprise. That, a presidentially appointed commission concluded, was the result of the eyes that had not seen, the ears that had not heard, the bodies that had not been there. In short, there were very few people of color like me working for the so-called white media, the man. Television or print and the white editors in the main didn't assign white reporters routinely to cover the black community. If they had, they would have known of the simmering rage over the conditions urban blacks lived in, and would have been able to telegraph that, if nothing was done, an explosion was inevitable. The Commission's prescription to the media was hire more people who live there and know what they know and can tell you and the world and the people who make policy what is going on. That was how I came to work in television for the first time around, and shortly thereafter the New York Times. My years at the Times spanned most of the 70s and included establishing the first Harlem bureau of the paper, not foreign in geographic terms, but a world away in mainstream coverage at the time. I became embedded in an unapologetic consciousness that embraced and celebrated difference. Colorblind and cultural neutrality not an acceptable part of the lexicon of my journalism. In fact, by the time I took up residence in South Africa in 1997, I had come to believe that while the Du Bois prophecy that the problem of the color line would be the defining issue of the 20th century, as unresolved as it was nearing the 21st century would see us balancing that with the problem of culture and the problem of cultural misunderstanding as well. When I arrived in South Africa in 1997, for most of the mainstream media, the story was over. Apartheid had ended, and that, after all, was what had brought them there. It had all the ingredients of old news: conflict and chaos, death, danger, and destruction, and thanks to the legacy of the Cold War, a framework of at least clearly defined evil, although good in this instance was a bit more ambiguous. The forces of liberation that I would have put in the good column were to others, after all, mostly black and mostly communists, and therefore mostly evil. So that line was a bit blurred from the beginning, at least for some. For me, 3 years after the first all-race elections, the story was just beginning. As the last society to take its place among the 48 liberated nations of sub-Saharan Africa, they were in the early stages of building a new society. The story for me is especially exciting, given not only the historical perspective I held as a result of my reporting over the last decade or so plus two, but of my longer historical perspective of having been a part of and lived to triumph over a system of injustice and oppression. I have to confess my sympathies were definitely on the side of the victims, as was the case with most of the reporters who covered me during the desegregation of the University of Georgia. But thanks to mentors I had during those days, along with my own upbringing at the nurturing hands of the preachers like my father and grandfather and the saints like my grandmothers, my definition of victim extended to those who were victimizers as well. So in addition to the admonition from the Black Panther, I also had the imperative that had driven my reporting since the early days, unapologetically looking at things through the prism of my own experience, which is what good journalists do no matter the color. Forget truth, it's too elusive and too much in the eye of the beholder. Thus, I'm inclined to be a bit more generous in my assessments of the country's progress over the past 9 years, as well as the continent's over the past 40-some, measuring it against the yardstick of progress of the young democracy that America once was. Moreover, I'm particularly sensitive to trying to strike a balance between those stories that have filled the landscape of African coverage, war, conflict, corruption, poverty, pestilence, disease, and the stories that tell us about the people who live amid all that, overcoming despite the odds. To be sure, the stories, and as Keith Richburg wrote, the bodies floating under Tanzania's Rusumo Falls Bridge, sometimes 2 or 3 together, bloated, horribly discovered, naked, stripped down to their underpants, etc., etc. The image and stories of genocide of Washington Post Keith Richburg that so turned his stomach and fed his Afro-pessimism are for now, we hope and pray, a thing of the past. Those who committed the genocide that he witnessed and that made him grateful that his ancestors survived the voyage that brought countless African slaves to America are in the process of being reconciled or tried for their crimes. That is not to say that awful things are totally a thing of the past, as only a few days ago in the eastern Congo, ethnic violence led to the massacre of close to 1,000 men, women, and children. And even as some of the continent's most devastating wars have been brought to a close in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Angola, in Sierra Leone, possibly Burundi, to name a few, the peace there is fragile, bearing close attention and scrutiny. Moreover, what is perhaps the biggest story of the kind that feeds the Afro-pessimist is the story of some 28 million Africans infected with HIV and AIDS, which is slowly but surely destroying their traditional African way of life, causing the breakup of the extended family, as grandmothers simply don't have the resources to take care of sometimes 10 or sometimes even 20 grandchildren left behind, because so many families are losing not just 1 and not just 2, but 3 and 4 of their children, and they have had children. So the thing just multiplies exponentially. In northern Namibia recently, I was there, and a government health worker told me that the extended family is now so overburdened that people simply turn their heads after the funeral when the discussion begins about what to do with the children. So African, un-African, she told me, with just almost tears in her eyes, but a sign of the times. This is an important story to chronicle in all of its devastating fury, and I make no apologies for making it a priority of my reporting, that and the ways different ways African governments are approaching the matter, good, bad, and indifferent. But the challenge of reporting Africa is for me similar in many ways to the challenge of reporting Black Americans when they were all but invisible. It's about coming in right. For example, Keith Richburg's successor came in and left from a different place. She called it Afro-realism. She writes that she had to grapple with ugly Africa, the Africa of horror and unspeakable brutality, the Africa that sometimes made me question the existence of God, the Africa I could not ignore if I was to claim the continent as my own. I witnessed the terrible warping of the human spirit, and I loathed it. I loathed the thieving of the likes of Mobutu and the legion of bribe-seeking bureaucrats his government begat. I loathed the repressive leaders who did as much damage to their people as the colonialists they replaced, and the warmongers whose aggression bred little more than chaos and turned back the clock on progress. This is Lynn Duke writing in her new book, Mandela, Mobutu, and Me. And Lynn, like Keith Richburg, saw inhumanity on a grand scale, particularly in Rwanda, where she encountered the mummified remains of thousands of hacked, bullet-ridden bodies in various poses of terror in a church compound turned killing ground during Rwanda's 1994 genocide, as did I. You cannot see that and not wonder about the existence of God. But she also had a different experience, as did I, that clearly leads her to a different place than the one occupied by the Afro-pessimists, where she met, quote, many people who taught her so much by the simple practice of their humanity and the exercise of their hope. More than their words, she writes in the epilogue to her book, they gave me a taste of Africa's essence, the surging aspirations and the crushing struggles I was fortunate enough to know and be able to cherish in all their bitter sweetness. Likewise, for me, hardly a day goes by that I am not reminded of that reality, and also reminded that I am different from my computer, such as the day when I was covering devastating floods in Mozambique that took the lives, homes, possessions of so many of its people. I had found the family living in a temporary shelter provided by a church after they had fled their town some 2 hours away in search of higher ground as the waters flooded in behind them. Father, mother, and 4 little children. The wife had been pregnant when the sudden rushing waters forced them to flee their homes in the night. They made it out of the neighborhood onto higher ground, but the rising tide of the waters followed. They took shelter on the roof of a house. With the rains beating down, the wife went into labor, soon giving birth to first one and then another baby girl. It was 3 days before the rain slackened and the waters receded enough for them to climb down from the roof. By this time, one of the twins was dead. With the image of the thousands of poor men, women, and children crowded into muddy refugee camps in my mind's eye, and listening to this incredible story, I turned to the father, who was a minister, and I asked him what had this awful time done to his faith in God. To my amazement, he said it had even made him stronger. He said God could have taken all of my children. Instead, he only took one. Faith like that is bound to take the edge off of even the most cynical souls. And since I count myself among the most cynical souls, what this man and his circumstance did for me was to recalibrate my moral antenna and infuse my journalistic product with passion. By the way, this family and I bonded. I guess it's that church thing, maybe. But a year later, I was visiting the United States, and my office called and said that this family was on the phone, and they wanted me to know that they had just had another child, another little girl. And the reason they were calling was not to inform me of the birth, but to ask if they could name her Charlayne. So running around Mozambique and all the various sundry names over there is a little Charlayne. And I get emails from them saying, "Dear Charlayne, Charlayne is growing, Charlayne is doing this." And one of these days I'm going to get over there and see this child. Living in a dynamic environment like Africa, hardly a day goes by that I am not reminded of that mission. And also, again, that I am different from my computer. Similarly, I have seen the ravages of AIDS, but I have met its victims determined to overcome. Survivors like Wendy Bawelele Zulu, a 12-year-old whose mother and father died of AIDS-related causes, leaving her alone to take care of her 4 siblings, the youngest of whom was 2. Her story went deep inside me and shook my soul. Stories like that are not hard to find, but many are hard to navigate without some help. As often as the foreign media are criticized for parachute journalism, few of us jump in with both feet and no parachute. In most cases, our parachutes are the local journalists, one of the key elements of coming in right. I am so indebted to African journalists from Lagos to Addis Ababa and points in between. I didn't say that just because I got a Lagos and an Addis Ababa over there, but it's true. They have been there for me unfailingly, and often at the end of a hurried phone call with everything from coffee to context. We pay them, but often the work they do for us is for the sheer joy of joining in a journalistic enterprise that will reflect the reality closer to the reality than the reality that more often than not gets presented as the truth. One of my most vivid memories was my first trip to Lagos, when I was new to radio and to most of the continent. Having survived the Lagos airport, and that's no mean feat, I made it to my hotel and called the local journalist, whose name had been given to me by Jerry Eddings, who was running the Freedom Forum in Johannesburg and was in touch with journalists all over the continent around the clock, because there's so few people out there to help them. The 1 or 2 that they identify, they just call all the time. And fortunately, most of them are so committed they don't mind. Within short order, this journalist had made his way across Lagos and proceeded to give me a primer on everything I needed to know about Nigeria, but with such modesty that I had to learn from someone else the story of his arrest and detention for months on end in solitary confinement during the days of Sani Abacha, one of the most abusive and brutal of Nigeria's long line of military rulers. My teacher had been subjected to near indescribable cruelty for doing his job as a journalist. I was invited to his newspaper to meet his colleagues whom he thought could be helpful to me. I was totally unprepared for what I saw. Reporters coming in from a story, preparing to write by pulling out paper from a huge roll of paper that sat on a desk, and that they would go over to and unroll and then go over to the end and tear it off the side of the page. The reporter would then find a place in the room where he could sit down, spread out his paper, and slowly craft his story. Later he would join the queue of other reporters waiting to hand their copy, prepared in the same fashion, to the typist who sat at the one computer the paper owned. When I asked about this, I was told, oh yes, we had another computer, but Abacha's men confiscated it, and after taking it to the police station where they said they had taken it for safety, they left them deliberately out in the rain. Fortunately for all of them, this reign of Sonny Abacha's terror didn't last. But over the next 4 years, I would encounter more of the same, only in other places. Brave young and not so young men and women doing the work of journalism under circumstances that most of us could barely imagine. I mean, how many of us could live without a computer or our emails? I almost had a fit a few minutes ago when I thought mine was broken. I almost couldn't catch my breath. Well, you can probably count on the fingers of two hands the numbers of African journalists who own or even have access to laptops, although internet cafes are providing access now more and more. Likewise, while many of us who are international correspondents dip in and out of danger, danger is the common denominator in the lives of most African journalists on the continent. As Jerry Eddings, journalist and former head of this Freedom Forum, said recently, African journalists have been murdered while attempting to cover stories, especially in conflict situations. At least 15 journalists were specifically targeted and murdered in Sierra Leone since 1977. And subsequently, at least 7 journalists received identical death threats of the sort the others received before they were, in fact, murdered. The Committee to Protect Journalists, on whose board I serve, reported 26 journalists in prison for their work at the end of 2002. 18 in Eritrea, 2 each in Togo and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and 1 each in Guinea, Sierra Leone, Niger, and Ethiopia. This, according to the researcher Yves Sorokobi, a stark increase from the end of 2001 when there were 15, the increase attributed to Eritrea. African journalists have also had their outlets banned in Liberia, Gambia, Angola, Zambia, and many other places. Zimbabwe's journalists have been engaged, often literally, in a running battle with the powers that be over legislation aimed at restricting their activities and their access to information. They had a major victory last week when a judge struck down one of the key provisions of the media law described by journalists there as draconian. Still, there have been dramatic changes in the journalistic climate on the continent in the last decade, with even journalists working for government-owned newspapers gaining new independence that enables them to do more than just regurgitate the party line, though that still goes on in far too many countries on the continent. But inroads towards independent voices being able to speak truth to power have been made, not least as more progressive leaders on the continent embrace the culture of democracy and its institutions, foremost among them a free and unfettered press. Those leaders, like the journalists laboring among them, have understood that there is a link between a free press and a free people and the advance of their societies. In Ghana, for example, African journalists took a great step forward 3 years ago when they participated in the first ever presidential debate organized by the Freedom Forum and moderated by yours truly. It was an event that captured the attention and the applause of the nation, and all but one of the country's 9 presidential candidates participated, and he lost. Moreover, it was Ghana's journalists who called in from cell phones to radio talk shows, reporting gross irregularities in the elections, even identifying by name a government agent who was stealing ballot boxes. Now, if you don't think that was brave, let me hasten to tell you, he was armed and they weren't. He was not armed and they were, except with the truth. He was armed, which was no guarantor of stopping a bullet. And while radio in the past has been used, as it was in Rwanda, as an instrument of hatred and violence, the Rwanda radio incited Hutus to kill Tutsis, it is now being used as a voice for the voiceless, stirring up passion for freedom and human fulfillment. In 1985, there were only 300 radio stations on the entire continent. Today, there are close to 2,000, and countries like Cameroon will soon be hearing voices of freedom as dedicated journalists there are in the process of establishing independent stations to help bring that country into the family of democratic nations. In South Africa, which has one of the most liberal constitutions in the world and one of the freest presses on the continent, President Thabo Mbeki has spoken often of the link between press freedom and the establishment of strong democracies, telling African journalists last year that, quote, they must be key players in the development of their countries through constructive criticism as well as thoughtful praise. He followed that this year, insisting African journalists must be Africans first. The debate over exactly what that meant is part of an ongoing exercise African journalists are beginning to fully engage in, finding their sea legs in Africa's unsteady progress towards democracy and establishing the space to tell their own stories. And while CNN and other foreign journalistic presences come in for criticism, hardly a new phenomenon, what was exciting to observe in the often spirited introspection, those who are earnestly trying to determine their place in the new environment, holds out the promise of Africa's taking control of their destiny, but which promise rests on a fragile compact between a new generation of leaders who have beckoned them towards an African renaissance that is still more of a rallying cry than a concrete reality. Thus, even as the outlines of the Renaissance that Mbeki himself first heralded become clearer through such instruments as NEPAD, the Plan for Economic Renewal embedded in the new African Union, Mbeki was pressed to admit that the African Union's Constitutive Act did not specifically address the issue of press freedom, as if to underscore Mbeki's own criticism of African media as being poorly informed about their own affairs in their own continent. By their own admission, none of the African journalists was aware of this omission. But while accepting the criticism, they also called on Mbeki, who is chairman of the African Union, to challenge governments violating press freedom, like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Swaziland. Swaziland, by the way, which has enacted a decree forbidding criticism of the monarchy. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights guarantees press freedom, but no one is quite sure how it could be enforced against recalcitrant governments. At the conclusion of the African Editors Conference a few weeks ago, there was a call for state media to become independent public service media rather than government mouthpieces, for monitoring attacks on journalists, ongoing training of journalists, especially on the topics of the African Union and NEPAD, better coverage of the African story from the African perspective, more news exchanges within Africa, research into existing charters and codes of ethics relevant to African media issues. And that's going to be very important because in so many of these countries that have been ruled by military dictatorships and where there's been very little space and where there's an awful lot of poverty, journalists all too often have been subjected to brown paper bags full of money handed under the table in exchange for favorable coverage. Editors familiarizing themselves with the documents that they need to understand the processes in motion on the continent. Earlier I spoke about the conditions under which many African journalists labor, with sometimes exceptional results. But it is neither fair nor productive to have them continue to struggle in this way, when what the world needs, let alone the African continent, is to hear and read the stories of Africa told by Africans themselves, fearlessly and unfettered. There are precious few resources available to help bolster the independence of African journalists, but there are some new initiatives, including a new organization called FAME, the Foundation for Africa Media Excellence, which came into being after the Freedom Forum closed its doors last year when the stock market in America crashed. FAME has attempted to form a nexus between African and African American journalists and anyone else willing to contribute to walk along this still difficult road with our African colleagues and with those who have dreams of being our colleagues. Many of those already in the profession took an even harder road with little training or encouragement, without a roadmap, as it were. Their passion for the profession, fueled only by the fire that burned inside them to do this thing we call journalism. Fame wants to help them now to fill the gaps in their professional development, providing resources that weren't available to them when they entered the field, particularly since many went directly into the profession from secondary school, never had an economics course or other formal education that would help them now unravel the complexities of a continent that, for better or for worse, is a part of this new global world still a-borning. Critical to the emergence of a new generation of journalists is assistance to those who are emerging from under the yoke of state-sponsored media to develop the codes of conduct and ethics that say no to those who know no other way but bribery and corruption, and the culture of sycophantism so rampant throughout the continent, if not the world. Heard a little of that here myself. For many of us trying to support the development of African journalists, including African journalists themselves, we have encouraged them to embrace the standards in the profession that are recognized, if not adhered to, the world over. It is important at this point in the development of new news on an emerging new continent to help encourage those with dreams of becoming journalists to realize those dreams. I'm often reminded of my own dreams of becoming a journalist, when such dreams were not supposed to be dreamt by young black girls growing up in the segregated South, in a society that would have consigned me to a life of servitude and not of service of my choosing. When I told my mother of my dreams, as most of you know, fashioned out of the comic strip character Brenda Starr, she didn't tell me to put away the comic strips, put away the pipe dreams, and do something real. She simply said, if that's what you want to do. For instinctively, my mother knew that dreams propel ambition. Little did she know that my first real assignment as a journalist would come when I was still a student, working for a muckraking little newspaper run by Atlanta activists in the civil rights movement who got arrested for civil disobedience by day and, after being released by night, wrote their first-person accounts. I wasn't allowed to get arrested because I had to keep my record squeaky clean because I was applying to the University of Georgia. So I stayed in Carl Holman's basement and waited till they came back from jail and edited their copy. Through its crusading work, this little voice of the movement would be a major player in exposing the injustices and putting an end to segregation in the state, thus bringing America closer to fulfilling the democratic promise of freedom, justice, and human dignity that we were all fighting for. Such is the spirit I have observed in many a journalist and would-be journalists working in Africa. A journalist whose most notable attribute is patriotism, but patriotism defining as holding governments accountable for how they treat their citizens and not flag waving. The press as watchdog and not as lapdog. And that's good news in the new news out of Africa. For if this spirit is nurtured and supported, Africans won't be the only beneficiaries. Their stories told from their own experiences will surely give rise to a new generation of Africans, but also to a new generation of people who live beyond its borders. People who will not have to ask, as they all too often do now, Africa, why do they call you mother? Do you have children like us? Who is there to tell us, to make us know? To tell us that you do have children who laugh and love and wrap their tiny arms around their mothers, that they chase their brothers and their sisters and catch them, sometimes in the slime of a refugee camp that is the only home they've ever known. And they have tumbled down fun even in the midst of misery such as you have never known. Africa, why do they call you mother? Because you are the mother of us all. And now we can know the new news about you and celebrate you, Mother Africa. Thank you very much.
Sure. By the way, we're having a reception back at Afroland. So please join us. Plenty of food, plenty to drink. Questions, comments? Tamadia is from Senegal.
About Sudan. We hardly hear about Sudan in news. What's going on in Sudan?
Well, when I last looked, which is just before I left South Africa a few days ago, you know, they were working on the peace. They have certain agreements. I don't know what the status of that is now, because I know there was real concern about the war in Iraq and the impact it was going to have on those who were playing a role like the United States, a positive role, for a change, a positive role on the continent. They were worried that their preoccupation with the war would let these very fragile arrangements just sort of drift off and maybe self-destruct. The other problem in Sudan right now is starvation. There are apparently millions of Sudanese in the southern part, especially on the verge of starvation. The World Food Program has sent out an appeal that they need support to provide food there. But I think, you know, one of the things I've tried to suggest in the last 3 days is that there is a new mood on the continent, and part of it is out of an optimism that something can change, and part of it is just out of war weariness. People are tired of fighting, even those who've been fighting. And so, you know, with this settlement in the Congo, and with this fragile settlement settlement, however fragile, in Burundi, and I don't know what's going on lately in Cote d'Ivoire, but you know, because it seems to be back on the edge again. But you know, there does seem to be this thing that's catching fire for whatever reason: exhaustion, optimism, combination of all of the above. So I'm not sure at this precise moment, because those situations are very fluid. They can change dramatically from one day to the next. But I know for sure that unless those people get some food and some shelter and some confidence that what they're doing is the right thing, there's going to be trouble.
I was unable to attend your earlier lecture, so I don't know whether you'd already talked on this subject, and if you have, just disregard the question. I was interested to know what the African perception of the U.S. was at this point, particularly in a context where you say there's a sense of war weariness on the one hand, whereas preemptive strikes, you know, this notion of preemptive war, has certainly inflamed the parts of the world that I know better, South Asia, East Asia, this area. You know, there's tremendous fear and criticism of the American role. Mm-hmm. No sympathy at all for Saddam's regime.
Exactly.
But enormous fear about this principle of preemptive strike in
Where are you from?
India.
Arundhati Roy was just in Johannesburg, right, and drew a huge audience. She's the author who wrote The God of Small Things, and then more recently a collection of her anti-war talks called War Talk. Right. And she drew a tremendous audience of, you know, I mean, South Africa is still to some extent segregated. I mean, you know, there are levels and layers, and people are trying, but mostly you go to one thing and it's all white, or mostly you go and it's all black, or it's all Indian and that like that. But this was one of the most integrated audiences I have seen, and this issue has brought together people in a way that few have, because South Africa and most Africans have been very much opposed to the war, which, in the words of Supreme Court Constitutional Court Justice Richard Goldstone in Johannesburg, was illegal. I mean, you know, African nations have been taught to believe in the United Nations and to believe in a process, and this process, in their view, was totally subverted. You know, even when they were still there in the United Nations, there was this sense, as you heard from Mandela's outburst before the war, that America was going to go unilateralist and to ignore the rest of them. So there is a residual feeling of bitterness. And so many African intellectuals that I talk to, you know, talk about you know, what kind of example does this set when on the one hand you're telling us that we have to stop having coup d'etat and, you know, we have to end the conflicts on the continent, we have to have a collegial arrangement and this and that, and then you go and in their words, recolonize a country. So it'll be interesting to see what the residual effect of that will be. As I said, I think it was yesterday, I have not personally sensed any animus as an American, and I don't know about other Americans, but there is definitely an anti-American policy that seems to separate from feelings about Americans in general. Although one talk show host told me, and I quoted him here yesterday, that, you know, it's Bush's policy, it's the policy of the American government, but the American government is by extension the American people. And so people don't really make that distinction. There is a sophistication. I mean, people will talk about Miami and the Chads and the Dimples and all that stuff with a greater understanding than any of us could talk about what goes on in their elections. But you know, it's a scenario that hasn't reached its end point. So I don't know what's going to happen. And I think a lot will depend. You could see the reporting shifting, not to a pro-American position, but up until the entry into Baghdad, all of the South African media coverage was anti-war. I mean, they would put pictures of children with bandages all over themselves, you know, from Baghdad and from all these other places that they had dropped bombs on civilians and stuff. So those things were played up prominently. And they made no apologies for tilting in that direction, even as they insisted they were still independent journalists. But they said that was their call on the thing. Once the toppling of the statue and all of that happened, and they started to unearth some of the horrors, you know, the reporting shifted, but not the support for what had been done. I mean, they were reporting what was going on, they were reporting some of the horrible things that were uncovered, but they have not gotten away from the fact that, however, this was an illegal and wrong thing.
Charlayne, I wanted to ask you, one Sunday, I was just flipping through, channel surfing, and there you were in that village with the little girl who had just published the book.
Oh, her, yes.
Yeah.
Moniwa.
Yeah, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was just great.
You saw that?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I am a Hunter-Gault watcher. What are you talking about?
Well, we try to give it to you, but sometimes the curtain comes down.
Well, that's really my question, which is, how do you decide what to report? And, I mean, that was a feature, you know, it was apropos of nothing except of everything. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, it was obvious if Sani Abacha is finally assassinated, you're going to cover that. Mm-hmm. But how do you, I mean, do you have to get clear with Washington? You decide? Do you...
Atlanta.
I mean, Atlanta, right?
No. I mean, you know, that's the wonderful thing about being a bureau chief and being in the field. You're sort of, you know, you have this image of those space capsules out there, and the astronaut walks outside and he's attached to the spaceship, but he's floating out there really on his own, you know. And that's what it is. And you have to be really strong in this job because, you know, they leave it up to, as my colleague told me when I was thinking about taking this job with CNN, she said, you know, you drive the car. And it's true. You come up with the ideas. I mean, sometimes in the middle of the night, something will flash and they'll call you. And sometimes it borders on the ridiculous. Like, you know, they'll call and say, such and such happened in let's say, Cameroon. And I'll say, well, you know, I'm in South Africa. And that's a long way from here. But I'm on the continent, right? So they figure I got to know. Chances are I have somebody I can call and find out. That's that whole that thing, my safety belt, my parachute that I rely on. I can call somebody. But mostly it's your own instincts, and I think that's why it's so important for you to come in right, because that leaves you open to things that don't have to conform to everybody else's view of what Africa is. You know, and I keep talking about Richburg, but you know, Richburg was a magnificent reporter. He just had he had so much trauma to his head that you know, he couldn't see what Lynn saw. I mean, Lynn saw the same bloated bodies and awfulness, and yet she also saw the humanity, and still identifies and is pleased that she can identify with her Africanness. But you know, you if you have a different perspective, which doesn't necessarily mean you have to be black or whatever, but if you just are willing to see, Joe Lelyville did a marvelous job covering South Africa. I don't know if you agree with me, but his book "Move Your Shadow" is a classic.
Great title.
Yeah, great title. And we've come a long way, by the way, since Joe was there. I mean, reporting as well as the continent has. But it's your choice. And often I would get up and look at what the local... I found Muniwa, this wonderful little girl who wrote this great little story. They're trying to encourage children to write and be creative as a way of improving literacy, and they've given this prize for the best piece, and she wrote this great story about it, Saved by a Mamba. I just said I want to meet her, because I saw a little girl from Covington, Georgia, and that little girl in the Limpopo province, and I said, let me go there. And without being immodest, I hope you won't think I'm being immodest, but I said she needs to see me.
Sure.
Because I came from that.
No, absolutely.
And she just called me. She called me the other night in the middle of the night, woke me up. She didn't know I was in America. And I said, Moniwa, I'm in America. I can't talk to you now. It's the middle of the night. She said, oh, okay, call me when you get back. But, you know, it's just wonderful making those kinds of contacts. But, of course, at the same time, as I said, I have just made it... I have made a decision that I'm going to cover AIDS from every angle that I possibly can. The good, the bad, the ugly. And even in all the ugly, there's good. I mean, you've seen the New Yorker with the profile of Zaki Ahmed. I had done that before the New Yorker. Obviously, I would like to think they were following me.
Of course.
But the piece is too long and too involved to have been all reported since my piece ran. But the New York Times also covered Zaki. So it's just whatever strikes you. And I've had colleagues who had some bad experiences in the beginning, and nothing strikes them as good. So they report, that person is no longer there, but everything was reported through that negative prism. So, you know, if you make a conscious decision that you want to ensure balance, and you want to report this new news, because I think that's like, you know, when I went to the New Yorker and nobody was writing about the black community, you know, that was how I got ahead, you know.
Sure.
But it was it was doing a positive thing. And I think that, you know, in as much as I'm seeing new news, I'm trying to report what nobody else is reporting. And it's very easy. I mean, you just walk out the door and there it is, you know, and people are so grateful for it.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
yeah. Africa has suffered so much from militarization over the centuries, and most of the arms come from the outside. And we know where the arms are coming from. And even now, there are very few African countries that actually manufacture their own arms. Now that we've got to the stage of rebuilding the continent and picking up the pieces after centuries of destabilization. What role, could you talk a little about the role women have played? Because there is need for feminization of the continent as opposed to militarization, which had rendered the continent totally destroyed the continent. And now that we've reached the stage of reconstruction, it looks to me that the women have a peculiar role to play in reviving and restructuring the continent.
Well, that reminds me of a story I heard when I was in Somalia a few years ago. they said that up until recent times, the women, they had reached a point, one of the many points along the way, where they got up to the door of peace and then the door closed and it didn't happen. And this was one of the first times, I can't remember now exactly when it was, maybe 7, 8 years ago. And the women were saying that they wanted to be included in the peace talks because there weren't any women in the negotiations. And they said, you know, women have always been used to help make the peace. And in Somalia, you know, it's a homogenous society. And so the women, I mean, everybody's related to everybody else. And, you know, however distantly. So they said whenever there was a conflict or something, the women from one tribe would just march out onto the battlefield and marry the combatants from the other clan, and that would be the end of the war, you know. It's not quite that simple anymore. And I think that there are, you know, civil society organizations trying to empower women. Women are on the cutting edge in much of the AIDS work. In the communities, they are doing a lot of the rescuing and nurturing of terminally ill patients. In South Africa, women are very involved in policy making, some better than others, as our South African friends will, I'm sure, attest to. But they're very high up, and some of them are extremely good in non-traditional roles within the South African government. And there are a few in other countries, like, I'm trying to think, is it Botswana, or I think it's Botswana, in some non-traditional roles. But I have to say that this struggle for women to gain their rightful place in the society of Africa is not totally different from here, although in many ways it may be a lot harder because you've had such entrenched paternalism over such a long period of time. You know, I mean, I get put in a really funny position when I try to compare things going on and progress going on in Africa with what went on in America, because I was looking at TV the other night and here were all these men complaining about this woman playing in this golf tournament. And I'm saying, wait a minute, we've been there, past that. But in a real way, we're not. And that's why I keep saying, you know, when we judge, you know, progress or lack thereof in Africa, we need to look at it in the context, not necessarily of America today, but in the context of America's evolution, where America was. Read, for example, William Safire's Scandalmonger sometime. And I know most of you probably in here probably won't agree with his politics, but his writing is brilliant. And Scandalmonger is a work of fiction based on fact, and it's about the, you know, the tabloid, nasty attack journalism that was going on between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in the early part of this democracy. So, you know, that helps sometimes in how you evaluate things that are going on in Africa. Of course, we're in a much more advanced stage where we find out things faster, and I think that puts a lot of pressure on development. It has to move a lot faster, and people are much more aware when things aren't moving fast enough, because they can look and make measurements based on concrete things that they can see. So I think that women have a long way to go on the continent, but I think there are a lot of conscious women who are working to ensure that there are at least pressure groups that insist on their participation, but they need help, and they need help from their sisters in America.
Bryce?
What does being in America, having been in America, going to America means to them?
What is, sorry?
What is being American, being in America?
For an African?
Yes, for the African.
I don't know. I think you have to ask an African that.
Well, how do you feel? How do they react to the whole notion of?
You mean?
It's not clear what you mean, Bryce.
Right.
I'm saying that there is obviously over more recent times a movement of Africans, students and others who come here. There's now more that there are refugees that come here. There are immigrants that come here. And perhaps in the same way that you can speak in North Africa about the relationship between that motion and Europe, I'm saying, what does it mean to the African to have an opportunity, if it's an opportunity, to be or to be going to or to be coming back from Africa?
Well, I think that's a complex question, and I'm not surprised coming from the source it did. And I'm not sure I know the answer, but it does provoke a few thoughts. And one is that I think on the negative side for Africa, there is a brain drain. Many of the young minds and many of those who are in positions to contribute significantly to the development of the continent are leaving for various reasons. And often I'm finding, I think one of the things that's really lacking, and I've heard a little bit about some of the projects some of you have around here, one of the things that's really lacking in South Africa, and I'm sure the rest of the continent, because South Africa is more advanced than most, is real data on things, real research information. Now we know and pretty much can calculate the exodus, as Mandela called them, the chicken runs from South Africa. You know, those who ran off to Australia and where else, New Zealand and the places they go. In part, some of them because they didn't want to live under a black government. They were fearful about that. But a lot of times it's economic. They can just make more money as a teacher. The nurses, there's a huge nursing shortage in South Africa because many of them are going to England where they can make more money to send back home to take care of their children. So, you know, it would be interesting to study just how much of this is really political and how much of it is economic. In South Africa, you know, for example, the doctors are now required to do community service, and they don't want to do that, so they leave. But, you know, some of it is a real economic thing. And when you have a lot of poor people, you know, to get an appointment with almost any kind of doctor in South Africa now is sometimes two months. You know, because there's so few. To get an appointment with a dentist or a specialist in Johannesburg sometimes takes a very long time unless you know, got friends or something. But I mean, it's tough because of the diminishing mass of professionals there. So that's one thing, the brain drain. On the other hand, I was talking to a Ghanaian the other day who was telling me about he's trying to get me to talk about this in this speech, and I swear I couldn't understand half of what he was talking about. But because he's an economist and a lawyer, and you know, the combination of the two is very bad. But he was saying that Ghanaians, for example, have all this money offshore, and they're living outside of the country, but they are just waiting a little while longer to make sure that Kufuor's, you know, government maintains and is fine, and that money is ready to come back, and they want to come back. So, you know, there are two things happening simultaneously here. You got a brain drain on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have a lot of young black Africans who are wanting to go home, and they are also looking at this new political equation to see if, in fact, what these new leaders like Mbeki and Obasanjo and all those guys who are talking about good governance and good economic management, if they're really serious, and if there are going to be mechanisms in place to protect them and their resources and their assets when they come back. But many of them want to come back, I think. But you know, I don't have any sort of scientific study on any of that, but it just seems to me that there are these sort of two different kind of trends going on, and you know, the African intellectuals are being encouraged to return. I mean, a lot of them want to come to South Africa because they've got institutions like the University of Cape Town, and you know, that would welcome, I think, welcome them to come back. You know, there's a little bit of unsettlement in higher education. You know, what is going to happen to the historically black universities, and you know, what all that's going to look like, and who's going to have the opportunity where. But you know, I think there are people who want to come back. So you just got to make at some point get the chicken run ones to collide with the ones that want to come back, and then they all get together and come back. I don't know how those who feel are in exile, you know, I mean, I just wouldn't know. You would know better than I. But, you know, it's not fair to ask.
No, it's not. Rita?
Yes, could you tell us why domestic CNN has so little coverage about?
I don't know, but I'd like you to write a letter and ask.
I could probably answer that. I used to work at CNN International in Atlanta. In a previous life, I was a broadcast journalist. I'm just really thrilled that Charlayne's here. Anyway, a part of it has to do with CNN's regionalization. So that news from the African continent is broadcast on the African continent. News generated in Asia is in Asia. So you have the anchors also who reflect these different regions of the world. And I would love to see much more international news on CNN.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for the audiences out there who have an interest, because there's some sort of notion on the part of media decision makers that Americans aren't interested in international affairs, which they may not be. But it's a kind of chicken and egg situation. You know, if we don't tease them and give them the kind of information and news and exciting stuff that we do, if we don't present it to them, we won't be able to cultivate an audience for international news. But I also think that the internationalists, like those of you in this audience today, really have to weigh in on this, weigh into the owners and weigh into the decision makers that we are interested and we do want to see news of the rest of the world. And as I said, I don't know whether it was yesterday or the day before, but I think it's okay to say it even once again. You know, you can make an argument based on altruism, or you can make it based on being enlightened, or what. But there are real compelling reasons nowadays that have to do with Americans' security, with American national security, that beg for Americans to be informed, because there are going to be decisions made increasingly in the name of security, in the name of national security, and you really need to know if these decisions really do reflect reality in the rest of the world. You need to know why you should pay tax, your tax money should go to feeding starving Africans in Sudan or in Burundi or Zimbabwe, for that matter. You need to know that these are breeding grounds for terrorism. And if people are not fed, their ideology is not democratic or communist or terrorist even. It's how am I going to feed my family? So if somebody offers them, they may not offer to be a human bomb. But I talk to kids, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, so those who were here, forgive me for repeating this, but I talked to these kids in Zimbabwe, some as young as 15 years old. And they had been recruited, they say, and there are plenty of people who back up their story, although the government denies this, but they say they were recruited by agents of the state and trained in killing people, opponents of the government. And they gave me details of people, oh, I killed so-and-so at his farm 15 meters from the street when he walked, because I had been taught. And I said, well, how did you do that? He said, well, we had been taught in classes, and I went by this place where they train these kids and surreptitiously filmed the place. We've been taught how to stand behind a tree, and when the person comes back, how to hook. He illustrated how to hook our arm around the neck, and then how you take the neck and twist it till it breaks like a chicken. Now, these are 15-year-olds. You know what I'm saying? And they have learned to like this. But aside from that, that's another issue. That's a psychological issue. But they were all lured into doing these dastardly deeds by the promise of food for their families, and earning money so that they could buy off the black market, because food is, there's not a whole lot there. And so I'm saying to myself, now these, and this one proudly told me, he said, yes, I was a Taliban from Mugabe. You were what? He said, I was a Taliban from Mugabe, and very proud of, except they've now left. and they're in exile, hiding out. I mean, you don't know what I had to go through to talk to these boys, and they're all a little strange. But you know, you have to appreciate what they've been through, because when they get a little weird on you, you're saying, "What am I dealing with here?" But they've been through a lot. Yeah, they've been through a lot, and they now have left because once the campaign was over, and there were there was no more reason to intimidate the opposition because the campaign was over. They didn't need them anymore, so they told them to get lost, go home. And that's when they decided, well, this wasn't a good idea. So I'm not sure that their consciences, because one kid told me about, he showed up at a place they'd been sent to kill people, and one of them was his uncle. And when he said, oh, wait a minute, that's my uncle, they said, you kill him or you be killed.
Did you kill him?
I didn't ask him. I didn't want to know. I mean, some things you just don't want to know. It's like the CIA tells you, say, okay, if I tell you, I have to kill you. And I just said, but you know, so they didn't, I'm not sure that it was conscience that gripped them to leave. It was, they didn't meet their obligations and promises. It had nothing to do with morality. So I'm saying, if so you get, your congressman is wavering about whether or not his constituency is going to support this African aid bill, you know, you think about why it would be in your interest to have your tax money spent that way.
Sure, absolutely.
You know.
We, Ken, you have a question. There's lots of questions, but we're really out of time. Why don't, for those of you who would like to ask questions, you can join us back at the reception at Afro-American Studies, and everybody knows what that is. But before we go back for excellent food and drink, let's give it up for Charlayne Hunter.